Welcome back, sweet people. Hey, what time is it?
I know. What time is it?
It's time to make the donuts. Yippee! If you've been following along on our baking adventures with Yeasty Beasties, we have baked, we have steamed, and yes, now we are frying. But before we can, we've got to make some dough. And this is a very special dough. It starts with something called tangzang, which is a starchy slurry that creates a very bouncy donut. And you start with the following ingredients. It's a half cup or 60 grams of all-purpose flour, and this is unbleached all-purpose flour with a protein content of 11.7. To that, I'm going to add a half cup each of water and whole milk. Not 2%, not 1%, not skim, whole. That's gonna go in next. If you've noticed, when I mix in the actual mixer, I will always put the liquids in first. In this case, I'm putting the flour in first because it's going to be easier to mix in the flour because this process goes relatively quickly. And I've got a whisk, so I can get in there and touch the bottom easily. If the flour goes in last, it ends up floating and then floating away from me. And this is a way of capturing it. Oh, Ian, can you come and watch? Because this is interesting, to me at least. So this process of tangzang is the gelatinization of the starches in the flour. And so what happens when you heat them up over 176 or 70 degrees centigrade, the starch starts absorbing the water and getting bloated. And it's retaining all this moisture so that the dough has structure. And this is a way of ensuring that you have a very tender and a very bouncy dough. And this is great for donuts because aren't they great when you bite into them and they're boing, boing, boing? That's my favorite. So if you have a recipe that you love to make donuts and it calls for water, why don't you use some starch water to make it even bouncier and better? How you get starch water is that when you're boiling pasta, save that water. But you also have to make sure not to over salt the water because then you'll get a very salty product with whatever you're baking. You can also use potato water if you're boiling potatoes. You'll notice that it looks almost milky, that mixture, and that's the starch. That's the stuff you want. It's a 1-for-1 swap. Oh, hey-oh, it's happening. And you'll see it thicken and you're going to whisk constantly. Otherwise, those milk solids will start burning and you want to get to the point where it is nice and thick, kind of like a roux, right? Like a really, really, really thick roux. Look at that. And that's what you're looking for. And I'm going to transfer it to a bowl and allow it to cool before it goes into the dough itself. Otherwise, it will be too hot for other things that go into it, like the yeast and the egg. You don't want scrambled egg in your dough, unless you do, and that's your thing. I'm not judging. So into a bowl and we'll let it cool. And I also cover it with plastic wrap because it can form a skin and get a little crusty. Also something you don't want in the dough. But if you want to, you could make batches of this ahead of time. In high production bakeries, what they do is they make huge vats of tangzang and then they divide it up into the measure that they'll need for whatever batches that they're making, store it in the fridge, and then just take it straight from the fridge, put it in the mixer, and mix. Fabulous. Good stuff. But guess what? I have one that's already cool. Yippee! Yes! So the tangzang is nice and cool, and that's going to go in first. All of it. Everything that you made is going in. And it's still bouncy. It's bouncy and lovely, and you can just, it feels very starchy, so you're going to get an idea of what's going to be happening in the dough itself. I always love foreshadowing. It's telling you it's going to be delicious. And then on top of that, an extra half cup of whole milk, liquids in first, and then 1 large egg. So when you break an egg, always do it on a flat surface. Don't do it on the corner of a bowl, because if there is any kind of bacteria or any bad oogies, they're going to be living on the shell itself. And if you crack on the side of a bowl, it's going to essentially send that shell into the egg itself and potentially contaminate the egg. We're baking this through entirely, so that really isn't an issue. Also, if you're going to separate that egg, if you want to separate the yolk from the white, if you get that shell in there, it's going to poke that yolk. And that's not what you want. So, flat surface, room temperature egg, and it's a reason for the room temperature, because later on I'm going to put in softened butter. And I want to make sure that everything that's going in here now is room temperature so that it doesn't seize the butter. If it will essentially turn it cold and make the butter turn into hard bits rather than being smooth and incorporate well. And here I have honey, and I have to call out my beautiful baking students because they are starting to bring me all of their honey from home. And so I'm never without something delicious. And it always makes me think of the sweetest people ever, my students. Thank you, students. And that is 63 grams or a quarter cup of honey. Get the best that you can find from your neighbors. And then salt, of course, that's going in. And then I'm going to add the flour. So this is 444 grams of all-purpose flour. So in both instances, we're using the all-purpose flour, unbleached. That's going to go in. And then, of course, the instant yeast, Platinum, is going to go right on top because it can, and incorporates really fast, really fabulous. And also, if you haven't seen it, I have a whole video on how to make these milk bread honey buns, but we're gonna make donuts. But that's all to say, you can make other things with it too. It's fabulous. So now this is going to go on the mixer. You're gonna say, but wait, what about the butter? We're gonna wait on the butter. So this is gonna start mixing kind of on that stir speed. And what we're trying to do at this point is to create some gluten development. Gluten does not develop until you add water and moisture. And then as you start mixing it, it starts to create these strands of structure. Yes. So the protein turns into the gluten strands. Fat impedes that. There are a couple other things that kind of impede it as well, but right now we're keeping the fat out because fat is the spanks or skims of flour. And if you coat it too soon, you're not going to get enough gluten development. So we're going to hold it back. It's not going to look great. It's not going to look like a dough, but it's going to get just enough development that I'm happy to add the butter and know that I'm going to have a really wonderful dough by the time it's done. So not a pretty sight, a very shaggy dough still, but a little gluten development goes a long way before you add the butter. This is what is called an enriched dough. And that means that it has things like fat, egg, extra protein and fat, and sugars by the way of honey. And that means that you need a very special yeast to handle all that competition. And it just so happens that Platinum yeast is that yeast. It's osmotolerant. And that's the kind of yeast you have to use with something that has all these variables that are so tasty, but can compete with the yeast and make it not so available to produce all the lovely gases that you need for a spongy and lofty bread. That's important. The other thing is because of all those ingredients that kind of make it moist and wonderful in the bake, it also makes it longer for it to mix. So it's gonna take about 10 to 15 minutes for full dough development. So now I'm going to add the butter a tablespoon at a time, and I'm not going to add the next one until it's fully incorporated. And this is half a stick or 56 grams of unsalted butter at room temperature or softened, which would be just a tiny bit softer than room temperature, but not melted. You do not want it melted. You want it to have structure so that when it's being incorporated, it does so slowly. If it's melted, what it'll essentially do is coat the dough rather than it be incorporated into the dough. So just make sure that it is soft enough though that when you put it in, you notice it kind of flatten out and start to be incorporated. And scrape if you've got to. And when you add anything to a moving mixer, do it from the side. Don't put anything into the mixer and get it caught up in the dough hook. That includes anything like your hair if you're leaning down, your hand if you're putting it in. If you gotta, stop the mixer rather than getting entangled in the mixer. Pro tip. And yes, you start your time after all the butter's incorporated. So 10 to 15 minutes after the butter's gone in. The shearing was happening. It's going up the hook, collecting itself, and then splatting again, collecting itself. Sometimes you get an added bonus where it has a baby. And what happens is a little piece of the dough will kind of collect itself off of it and start running around Like while mama is going, the little baby will go around with her. So now I'm going to transfer this to an oiled bowl. And it's beautiful, soft, smooth, and hard to handle in this state. It needs to bulk ferment or have its first proof and double in size. For this dough, I like to do this in the refrigerator, which slows it down quite a bit, but that means that once it has risen, it is nice and cold and in perfect shape to shape. You need it cold, otherwise it'll be too sticky. And we're doing something very specific. We're doing a donut shape, and we want it to stay round, and we're trying to get a little hole out of it. So the colder, the better. So you, my friend, are gonna go in the fridge. But as it so happens, I have a cold risen dough. That's a happy dough. And then when you shape it, that's the second proof, where you're proofing the individually shaped or final shape of the dough. Sometimes it's a loaf, sometimes it's multiple donuts, which is what we're doing. So you're gonna go fridgy, I'm gonna roll you out. I'm not going to dust my bench with flour, I'm just gonna put a little nonstick spray, because if you have a coating of flour on your donut, when it goes to fry, it creates this really crusty and strange outer exterior, and we want to avoid that. So a little oil is perfect because it's gonna go into oil. So this should kind of plop out in one lovely and pretty stiff round, ta-da! But it has lovely aeration. It's risen beautifully, but it's cold, which is exactly what I want. It'll make it so much easier to roll out and shape. And now I'm degassing it. I'm knocking it down so that I'm gonna roll it anyway, right? If I had just continued to roll instead of knocking it down, that is also degassing because it's getting those big bubbles out. But now it's getting its second feed. Now the yeast is in closer contact with its food so that it can continue doing its work, creating texture and taste and rise. Now I'm going to roll this out to between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 of an inch thick, and it's the depth that we're going for in this so that we get an even rise. And this is just a handy dandy pin that has a groove in it so that you get the depth of the dough pretty immediately, but you can just use a regular old rolling pin. Usually I never roll over the edge, but this one's okay because I'm not going to be compacting the edges. It's going to stay the exact same depth. And then over here I have my donut punch, and then I have some pieces of parchment. So every time I punch out a donut and the donut hole, I will have a little piece of parchment for the hole and a little piece of parchment for the donut itself. And that is because when I fry these, I'm going to put the donut into the hot oil while it's still on the parchment. That way you don't have to pick up this very floofy, which is the word of the day, risen donut. If it's sitting there on a piece of parchment, you can just let it ride on the parchment and actually put the whole thing in the oil and then gently take it out. So now, as it rises, it will retain that shape. And I have a plan for the extra pieces as well. I always have a plan. And as you go along, if you notice, like this one right here, it's looking a little oval. Ooh. So I'm just going to, before it starts rising, I'm just going to give it a little more of a round shape. And if you want to, after you roll it out, you can do it on a piece of parchment and then transfer the parchment to a sheet pan. And then before you start stamping out the donuts, you can let it cool in the fridge for a little bit. That'll do two things. It'll make the dough super cold and even easier to punch out, but it'll also allow the dough to relax, because sometimes the second you have rolled it out, if you punch out too quickly, the dough will shrink back and it could become an oval in the oil. So if you let it rest again, that will allow it to relax and keep its shape, keep its round shape. That's totally up to you. I'm gonna go for it. I don't mind oval donuts. They taste just as good. This dough feels great too. I've got to make room for all these because they're going to be rising, and so I don't want them to stick to each other or stick to each other's parchment, because when you pull them apart, that can make them deflate. So these guys are going to find another home. That's okay. I'm going to spray these and then loosely wrap them in plastic wrap so that they can rise without forming a skin. Now these are going to proof more quickly than what I'm doing next. And what I'm doing next is I'm going to create little bun type shapes that will eventually become filled donuts, because apparently that's the thing in this room. So I'm going to make, if you did remember steaming, when we made the bao buns, I created a little parcel. This is a larger version with a slightly different dough, but the procedure is the same. You make the parcel and you pinch that together to make a seam on the top. Seam down, claw, and then roll that into a lovely ball. And then that will also go onto a piece of parchment, and then I'm just going to gently, boop, flatten it. You don't have to make the noise, but it helps. The donut knows that it's been appreciated. You rolled out the dough. Why couldn't you just stamp out rounds instead of making buns? And it's because they don't quite get the right shape. They don't get as round and as, word of the day, ding, 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 floofy, as they should be. I have wanted to be able to just roll them out and stamp them out into a round, and it's just not the same. So making them into a little bun, and if you want to weigh the dough, it's 75 grams per bun. That makes them spot on. So each one will be exactly the same size. These were my mother's favorite treat in February, because in February does anybody know what's happening in Germany in February? In Germany it's called Fasching. And one of the things that they eat are something called, and don't make fun, Krapfen, but they are jelly-filled donuts, usually like currants, see, jelly-filled, with just a little bit of confectioner sugar on top. And once these are all shaped, they will proof, and then you know it's coming. It's fry time. I'm more than ready to fry at this point. I'm heating my oil to 350 degrees. And it's kind of a very specific temperature. Obviously, for baking, 350 is the #1 temperature. Also for frying. And it's because if you are too much higher than 350, 360, what will happen is that your donut will essentially seize. It won't rise, and it'll be compacted, and you won't get that wonderful floofiness. Ding, ding, ding. If it is too low, what will happen is that the donut will start taking in the oil. It will literally ingest the oil and get greasy. So below 350, if you start going to 340, you're gonna have an oily and greasy donut. So 350 is kind of that magic area where things do really well. Make sure you have a really good thermometer. Thermometers, like ovens, are big fat liars. So invest in a good one. I'm using an induction burner, which can affect some digital thermometers. So I always have to use one that has a bigger casing, and this is Thermapen by ThermoWorks, which doesn't go haywire from the magnets in the induction. Also, if you've got a pacemaker, you have to be 2 feet away from this puppy, because the internal mechanism does something to the pacemaker that is not good. So just be aware of that as well. So we're at 349. It's time to test. And I'm going to test with our donut holes. So I think we should leave the animals out of it, like canary in a coal mine, guinea pig. They don't need to be a part of this experimental. We'll call it donut holing from now on. So when you want to test something, you donut hole it. And you put in the parchment and you let it go, and we see what happens. So I see that they're expanding. They're not browning too quickly. So if it were too hot, they would not expand. They would get like deep brown very quickly. If it were too low, they wouldn't expand either. They would take much longer, and they would start seeping in that oil, and they would get claggy, and they wouldn't expand as much either. And you continue checking to make sure that it stays there. Claggy is a word, and that means like compact and too chewy and like will gum up your mouth. So we're a little higher. I'm adjusting the temperature as I go. It can happen that the temperature changes based on what you're putting into the oil. So if it's something very cold, it will draw down the temperature. So don't overcrowd this. And this is our just test batch, so I'm only putting in 2 for now. They're looking really nice. But I'm just going to give them about a minute on each side. And I'm going to dip them into some cinnamon and sugar so I have a snack. But I will continue checking the temperature. You'll also notice I'm in a relatively shallow pan. My preference is to do something that is like a Dutch oven that's taller, and then only fill it halfway up with oil for maximum safety. And that's what I recommend you do at home. I don't recommend you at home having the oil this high up. It should always be half to lower than half, just to be safe. Also be careful of putting anything wet near or on the oil. That's when it really splatters. So any water will make it fly and be painful. Oh, look at that, they're gorgeous. I will let those cool ever so slightly, get some of that oil off, and then into some cinnamon and sugar. I'm ready for snacks. And I can feel it as I'm picking it up. It has give, which is really nice. So I really want to eat that now, but I don't want to burn my mouth just yet. So I'm going to go in with a donut. I'm going to carefully pick it up. I'm going to carefully put it in upside down, and it's floating. That's fantastic. That's looking good, and I will continue checking. 354, that's perfect. I'm gonna keep going. I'm at my last 3 traditional donuts, so I'm just flipping them. They're looking beautiful. I'm using canola oil. You can use vegetable oil, anything that is relatively flavorless and that has a high heat point. That's what's also important, because otherwise it'll start burning. But use the oil that feels good to you, that has all those factors to it. And I'm going for that kind of nice golden brown. You don't want a deep brown, because then you will literally taste the burnt flavor. And I can fry everything here with the same batch of oil. You will know when your oil has gone bad, because you will smell it. I always make sure that I have an old oil container left over to put it back into. Don't put it down the drain. And if you have a recycling facility that takes used oil, go find that, because oftentimes they will use that oil to, power some cars, which is pretty cool. Gorgeous, gorgeous, happy donuts. Now, while these are still warm, I'm gonna move on to my filled donuts. I'm checking the oil temperature. We're at, drum roll please, 348, that's kind of perfect. And don't let them plop in, because they will splash, because they have a decent amount of weight to them. And that weight will give you a lovely belly flop splash, and that will burn. This is hot oil. So now it's time to make glaze to fill these puppies, and then get some confectioner sugar. Oh, I can also do some donut holes. So this is 2 cups of confectioner sugar that I am going to just sieve to get any lumps out from the very beginning. And then I have a 1/4 cup of whole milk. Over to the side, I have a teaspoon of vanilla bean paste. You can also just use vanilla extract, the real stuff, 1-to-1 swap. You can leave it out entirely as well. And then there's also a pinch of salt hiding in there, hiding in that confectioner sugar, just to give a little bump of flavor. So it's not all too sweet. Once it's sifted, I'm going to add both the milk and the vanilla bean paste, which will give it so much great flavor and those little lovely flecks of vanilla bean. And then I'm gonna start with a whisk, and then I will go to, if I need it, the spatula. I always have them both handy in case there are still lumps in there, that I can smush them out. It's looking pretty smooth. Yeah. That is pretty. Yes, please, and thank you. Time for dipping. So when you're holding the donut, hold it right in the middle. Put it obviously face down and do a wiggle, wiggle, jiggle, jiggle. And then allow it to drip a little bit before you turn it up. So the reason the jiggle is important, and you can actually see what's happening, there are little bubbles in there, is that I'm trying to get through any kind of aeration in there so I get a smoother glaze. It really makes a difference to have that vanilla and that just pinch of salt, because it kind of cuts through everything, elevates the flavor, makes it a little more nuanced. It's time to fill the filled donuts. I'm going to fill them with jam. I'm going to top them with confectioner sugar. And to fill them, I'm going to use an 801 Ateco piping tip. It's just an open piping tip. And then when you put it in the pastry bag, make sure that you don't cut the hole open too much, because you're going to be putting some force, you're going to be applying force, and it could just shoot right out if you have too little encasing it. It has happened. Before you fill any pastry bag, always do the following. You twist and you tuck, so that when you're filling it, it doesn't go flowing out before you're ready. Then you're going to make a really hearty sleeve. And then you're gonna open up that sleeve right there. So you've got some that's kind of hanging over your hand, and then you've got all this room in there for putting your stuff so that it doesn't get over here. And then go to town. And then use your thumb or your hand to scrape any filling off and back into the bag. Come on. But when I go to stab my donut, I'm going to put a little pressure on the bag so that the pressure of going in the donut doesn't send the tip back into the bag. So put just a little pressure down, making sure you're not like spouting out a bunch of jam, but so that it doesn't go force back in. So a little pressure, and I'm going to stab it. And then in we go. And you'll hear it burp and it will get heavier. That's a full donut. And then to top it off, just a little confectioner sugar. Or a lot of confectioner sugar. And that's a filled donut. If you have Nutella, whatever you want to fill it with. Pastry cream, you could get a Boston cream donut, put pastry cream in there and put ganache on top. Fabulous. So go play, have fun. It's your donut. And if you like this video and the series, punch down, like, and subscribe, and make yourself some donuts. It's fry time. If you're interested in more in-depth classes, both in person and online, visit sugargliderkitchen.com. Hey, don't forget to punch down those like and subscribe buttons.